Ireland. Today, the webinar is all about COP26. As we all know, UN COP26 Summit on Climate Change will bring parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN framework on climate change. COP26 proposes an array of extensive goals. It will explore ways of securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. How to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, mobilize finance to fund adaptation programs, and enhance collaboration between vital stakeholders will also feature prominently on the menu of the conference. While net zero remains a tantalizing anthem in the West, it has a blunt pitch in Africa, with Africa grappling with mind-boggling energy poverty and a low emission per capita. Opinions are divided as to whether the aspiration of the UNFCCC are worthy of commitment. Recent development in Nigeria has reignited the debate of what should be the priority of a giant that cannot generate electricity to power its industries and free 39% of its population from extreme poverty. So today, we shall be considering these issues, and we shall be hearing from seasoned researchers and lecturers. The first person that will be presenting in today's webinar will be Dr. Pedi Obani. Dr. Pedi Obani is a lecturer with the University of Bradford. I know she doesn't know that I know this. She is also an alumni of Hala College, Port Harcourt. Another person that we're presenting is Dr. Chukwuka Monye, who is also a research fellow with the University of Sussex. Monye is also a member of the Science Committee of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the last speaker would be Dr. Ayodele Ashekome, who is a senior lecturer at Robert Gordon University. So before we commence with the presentations, I would want the speakers to introduce themselves to the audience, and then we'll take it up from there. So is Pedi there?
And can you please hold on? And now, before the speakers, please, we want to welcome everyone. Perhaps you saw, if you joined my screen, this is the Nigerian Environmental Society UK chapter. I'm the chairperson, and we want to also thank every member of this chapter for the great work. Particularly, want to thank Barrister Holu and Dr. Wifa, who were the committee that worked on this webinar. We want to appreciate you for the good work you've done. Thank also all our speakers who have agreed to be here today. And I would think that it's going to be a great one. I'll leave the work done now for our speakers to introduce themselves.
Dr. Pedi.
Hello, good afternoon, good day, everyone. And thank you for the introduction. I mean, it threw me off my feet because you know me, rich house, as we say. It's a small world, really. My name is Pedi Obani, as introduced, and I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to our discussions over the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedi. Monye, are you there?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chuka, and I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to having very fruitful discussions with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Monye. Dr. Ayodele Ashekome, are you here?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here as well, and looking forward to what I think is going to be very fruitful discussions this afternoon. Again, a little bit about myself. Like you've introduced, I don't think I need to add more, but I'm a senior lecturer in accounting and finance with the Aberdeen Business School. My background originally, I'm proud to all of this stuff about transitions, was mostly in oil and gas accounting. So it's interesting to see how all of this fits together with the legal dimension and the technology side and all of the discussion. So looking forward to listening to other speakers as well and getting feedback from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Ayodele. Dr. Paddy Obani, can you please start your presentation?
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Paddy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we're here.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to start by apologizing that I'm having technical issues, so I'm joining from my phone. Just trying to work with the committee to see how best to possibly share my slides in the course of the presentation, but I'll go ahead anyway. I'm happy to be here. Just to mention that my background is in law. So I'm a lawyer and I teach law, but I've also had the privilege of working with people who are actively involved in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, and people who are also actively involved in climate change advocacy. So I like to think that I sit in the middle of all of this. And it's from that frame that I look at this issue of COP26 and its implications for Africa and Nigeria in particular, and more directly at the legal perspective. I mean, it's almost impossible to take out one aspect, because you find that when you talk about climate change, it's all connected. The legal aspect, the economic aspects, policy, and all of those are all connected. So I'm happy that other colleagues will be sharing on the other aspects as well. But because I'm just starting, I'd like to kick off by giving some just preliminary discussions around what does COP26 mean for us? I mean, it's been introduced already by Charles, but I'll just touch a bit on that. Now, to start with, we're talking about COP26 and its implications for Africa, but I'd like to start by saying that Africa is a continent. And I say that with every sense of seriousness, because when we have these conversations and we say Africa is a continent, we say it almost as though we're trying to tell others that Africa is a continent and trying to remind them not to think that we are all the same as one peoples when we refer to the continent. But I think at the same time, when we think about climate change, is one of those issues that also reminds us that even as Africans, we need to always bear in mind that we are a continent and not a country. And this is because when you think about climate change, the impacts for every country in the continent is slightly different. You know, while we're coming at it as one continent, we have a joint position in negotiations at the COP and maybe other fora, international fora. At the same time, the implications are very often nuanced and need to be contextualized. Because, I mean, we have shared experiences of climate change. So it's no news that, for instance, most African countries are grappling with economic problems. They have resources that are not, possibly not giving them the most that can be gotten out of those resources. And poverty is there, there are climate change related conflicts. So all of those things are there and will be part of our shared heritage as a continent. But at the same time, the very direct implications of climate change are slightly different. And at the same time, also, the contributions that we make as countries in the continent are slightly different. So a country like Nigeria, that is renowned for its gas flaring, for instance, would probably not be in the same position when it comes to contributions to climate change as some other countries that may not be as actively involved in oil and gas production. So just to put that in context, you know, that this is a continent with shared experiences, but different and differentiated impacts when it comes to climate change. Now, of course, we've already mentioned the fact that the continent's contributions to emissions are minimal, even though the impacts are great. But I'd also like to mention that African governments spend around 2 to 9% of their GDPs on adaptation programs already. You know, so it shows that, again, climate change is already impacting directly in very serious ways, even on other development issues within the continent. Because if such a significant amount is being spent on adaptation, it then means that this is taking up funds, you know, that could be used for other development priorities within the continent. And this is something that shouldn't be taken lightly. Now, when we come to Nigeria in particular, of course, we've mentioned the fact that Nigeria is very often pointed to as one of those who contributes to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, particularly because we are responsible for gas flaring, you know. But beyond that, it's also important to mention that we are already beginning to feel the impacts of climate change in Nigeria. And one of the main aspects that has been mentioned is in terms of heat. So, I mean, if you talk to most people in Nigeria, they will tell you, oh, it's been really hot, especially over the past few months before the rains set in. But even with the rains, it's been really hot. And this is an indication, you know, that something is changing. Things are not the same. And we have to be mindful of the fact that when we talk about increasing heat, this has implications for very many other sectors. So it's not only about the physical environment, but it's also about the health, it's also about people's livelihoods, it's also about agriculture and yield. All of these things are affected. And in the end, it also points from a legal perspective, it also points to the fact that when we think about climate change and what we need to do, we need to approach it as a multi-sectoral issue. We need to approach it as an issue that is not only about the physical environment, but it's also an issue that has very serious implications for people's health, people's access to food, people's access to livelihoods, people's access to even education. Because when we have impacts like flooding that destroys infrastructure, that has serious implications for people being able to even go to school. In some parts of the country, you've seen, or we might have heard news reports about during the rainy season, floods, even carrying away school children who are trying to cross the roads, you know, because they are washed away by floods. So those kinds of problems already happen. Mortality is being affected. So these are cross-cutting multi-sectoral impacts, which we need to be mindful of. So while we may approach it from our respective disciplines, I'm just trying to mention the fact that the legal aspect is really important because there are very many rights that are implicated in climate change impacts. So that is something to think about. Now, in terms of the direct goals of COP26, there are 4 main goals. So one of them is securing global net zero emissions by mid-century and keeping emissions to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and then adapting to protect, carrying out adaptation to protect communities and natural habitats. And there's also a goal on mobilizing finance, and then there's a goal on working together to deliver. Again, each of those goals has legal implications. So the first one about mitigation, the second one about adaptation are those that we very often talk about, especially from the perspective of environmental science, engineering. In fact, there's a very heavy technical approach to these issues. And I'd like to focus on those 2 especially. Now, mobilizing finance is also important for Nigeria and has legal implications, same as working together to deliver. But I'd like to focus on those first 2 because very often we talk about this 2, and very often it would appear that these 2 have direct implications for government's responsibility and people's rights and, again, obligations towards climate action. Now, what is the legal basis for climate action in Nigeria? We can begin from the Constitution. Now, the Constitution places a duty on the government to protect the environment. And while, I mean, we've had debates, Barrister Aholu might be smiling, but we've had debates around, is this justiciable or not? But I think that has been laid to rest by recent court decisions, which clearly show that the government has a duty to protect the environment. And this obligation is not only within the Constitution, but is also linked to the government's responsibilities, even in regional legal instruments. So if we look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, for instance, it clearly provides a right to a healthy environment, or at least a right to an environment that is a certain quality and standard that protects people's livelihoods, protects people's ability to develop, you know, sustainably, and all of those things. So all of this have implications for the government's duty. And I would say that it creates an obligation on the government to protect the environment. So that is one thing. Now, beyond that, within international climate change framework, the legal framework, if we look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, if we look at the Kyoto Protocol, and more recently the Paris Agreement, all of these create legal obligations, again, for the government, you know, to protect the environment, but also more directly to take deliberate steps to ensure that, that there's action to address climate change. So the government needs to be seen not only as actively working towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also needs to be seen as empowering its citizens to be able to adapt. because adaptation is also an important aspect of this, because whether we like it or not, something is changing, and this thing that's changing has implications for people's developments, for people's livelihoods, for the quality of life, and all of those things. So essentially, people need to be supported, and we find that with climate change, as with most problems, those who are most vulnerable are very often unable to protect themselves against the worst impacts. So this creates an obligation on the government and, of course, the international community. But I'm looking at it more from the perspective of the government, because very often we talk about the international community. And beyond the climate change commitment, when we look at, again, international, regional, and domestic human rights and environmental commitments, we'll find that there are obligations which support this goal for protecting the environment, and more importantly, for taking climate action. And when we look at court decisions, we will also find that there are decisions that have been reached by courts in Nigeria at the regional level, which again support this call for action for climate change. This would be slide 6, please. That support this call for climate change. Thank you. And then to the next slide. But I'd want to mention that, I mean, it's one thing to have laws, it's one thing to have legal instruments, it's one thing to have institutions, but more importantly, there needs to be allocation of adequate resources. And this would mean financial resources, human resources, natural resources that actually ensure that these legal obligations, these legal commitments are met. Now, if we look at the case of SERAP and Federal Republic of Nigeria, it was clearly stated by the justices of the ECOWAS court that the adoption of legislation, no matter how advanced it may be, or the creation of agencies inspired by the world's best models, as well as the allocation of financial resources in equitable amounts, may still fall short of compliance with the international obligations in matters of environmental protection if these measures just remain on paper and are not accompanied by additional and concrete measures aimed at preventing the occurrence of damage or ensuring accountability with the effective reparation of the environmental damage suffered. And within this context, I'd like to say that this brings us home, really, when we talk about Nigeria, because very often when you speak to people, they'll tell you, look, the problem of Nigeria isn't one of lack of laws, it isn't one of lack of policies, but very often it is about implementation of the measures that have already been legislated upon. And as I've discussed in the previous slide, I mean, we have a legal basis for climate action, that is in no doubt. So it's now about having concrete measures that actually address the problem. And while we think about, I mean, if we go to the next slide, when we talk about the recent developments, we've had developments such as a national gas expansion program, which is focused on developing liquefied petroleum gas for the domestic markets as well as international markets. We've had policies on removing subsidies on petroleum. We've had subsidies on waste. We've had subsidies on policies on, again, strengthening regulation in the water sector. And then we very recently had more developments around the climate change bill. Now, with the climate change bill specifically, the next slide, we'll find that it provides for the establishment of a National Council on Climate Change. It provides for climate change fund, carbon budget, a national climate change action plan. It provides obligations for ministries, public entities, private entities. So it essentially provides for a wide range of stakeholders to come together and act on climate change matters within the Nigerian context. It also provides for partnership with civil society, youths, and it provides for climate change education. Now, moving on to the next slide, all of this shows that there's some efforts being made to provide a legal basis for action at home beyond our international commitments. Now, when we look at our nationally determined contribution linked to the Paris Agreement, we find that Nigeria has committed to unconditional contributions of 20% below business as usual, and an additional contribution of, well, not additional, but with international support to contribute as much as 47%, which is consistent with 1.5 degrees pathway. Now, that is something that's really important for us to look at, because essentially what we're saying as a country is that if the international community does not support us, we will only do 20% below business as usual emissions. But we are aware that this is not anywhere close to what is required to reduce or to address the problem of climate change. Now, yes, we talk about the fact that Nigeria's emissions are limited. Nigeria's contribution to the problem has been limited. So why do we have to take on this burden? But I think we have to be mindful of the fact that if we do not want to take on the burden, then we shouldn't say we will take on that burden. But if we're going to international fora and saying this is what we will do, then we have to be able to hold the government to account. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we will see what the government has taken on as its mitigation and adaptation priorities. In terms of mitigation, there are provisions on ensuring that the energy sector, agriculture, forestry, and land use, waste, industrial processes and products use, and then short-lived climate pollutants are all addressed within the context of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What does this mean for us? Now, from a legal perspective, when we look at the energy sector, for instance, one of the issues that's in place is that the government has in plans, policies and plans to convert associated gas into a form of energy for different uses within the economy. Now, this is all well and good, but we have to remember that all of this has implications even for the communities in which this gas is found. How are we going to deal with issues of historical pollution? So it's one thing to say going forward, we're going to stop gas flaring and we're going to put things in place to ensure that this gas is converted into energy that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But we have to be mindful of what has happened in the past and how this affects people's rights as citizens. Now, within that context, we already had a court decision as far back as 2005, which put an obligation on the government to stop gas flaring, but that was not enforced even till date. So one thing we have to remember again from a legal perspective is that it is very important for us to find ways of ensuring that there's compliance with the laws and with the court decisions that exist. Now, when we look at agriculture, forestry, and land use, there's talk about climate smart agriculture and forest management. Again, this has implications for the rights of indigenous people. When we sit, I think one thing I want to mention is that we always also have to be mindful of ensuring that our responses are not elitist, are not far removed from the realities on the ground. Because when we talk about climate smart agriculture, we talk about forest management. Where are these forests located? And to what extent are we engaging with the people in whose communities these forests are located to ensure that we do not, in the process of trying to address climate change, create problems for them, trample on their rights? We have to be mindful that as a society, we are not only dealing with formal laws, but we are also dealing with a historical background of customary practices, customary rights linked to land ownership, linked to access to water and water ownership. And all of this needs to be taken into consideration as we fashion solutions to the climate change problem. How many minutes do I have, just in case?
You don't have any more time, but we'll give you another 3 minutes to round off.
Thank you very much. And now in the waste sector, we talk about circular economy, for instance. So we have to be mindful from a legal perspective that we need a legal framework to support that. And providing a legal framework to support waste management would mean that we need to move away from, if you look at most of our laws, our waste management laws, they're mostly focused on sanitation. We need to move beyond sanitation to think about how to convert the waste generated at different points, households, public places, into actually resources. In that, we're reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but also empowering people within the environment. So, I mean, in the course of the conversation, hopefully we'll have more opportunity to look at all of this, but I'd just like to end by saying that when we look at adaptation, the water sector is mentioned as one of the priorities for adaptation. And if we think back to what has happened with our water sector law in the country, we'll also find that politics plays a very important role in charting a pathway for addressing climate change. So my call for action to all of us is, as we think about what to do in our own spaces to contribute to reducing climate change emissions from Nigeria and also supporting adaptation, let us remember that there are legal implications. Let us also remember that there are political issues that need to be addressed within the legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pedi Obani, for that wonderful presentation. We all will have the opportunity to ask questions when the time is right. We want to take questions at the end of all the presentations so that the questions will be streamlined. So without wasting our time, I want to call on the second speaker, Dr. Monye Chukwuka, to go ahead with his presentation. Dr. Monye, are you there?
Yes, I'll just try to share my screen now.
Okay. Sorry, just to add, if you have any question, please can you type it on the chat? The secretary will help us. The secretary will help us take note of them, and then we could easily assess them when they are done with their presentations.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And that was a nice presentation from Dr. Peddy. And I hope I'll be able to build on that tempo. I've titled my presentation COP26 and Nigeria, Strange Bedfellows. And I'm Chuka Mondi, and I'm at SPRU, University of Sussex. I think I'll just make a correction to what Charles said. I didn't work with the IPCC. I was with Elsevier. I was on their advisory panel for the net zero report that is coming up during the COP26 meeting.
Okay.
And this will be the outline of my presentation. And I always like to start with these quotes from Hannah. And the summary of this quote is that whenever action is demanded, action is what should be given. There really is no substitute for action. Statistics, I believe, is very important. Yes, I agree that Benjamin Disraeli actually said that there are 3 types of lies, damned lies, and statistics. But here, statistics are very important because they help us situate issues and then help us ask objective questions. From the figures I've presented here, one of the things we will know, and the earlier speaker did allude to that, is the fact that Nigeria actually does not have any significant contribution to emissions, CO2 emissions. We really do not have significant contributions to that. To put that in perspective, Nigeria has about 4 times the landmass of the UK. We have about 3 times the population of the UK. But then the UK has about 4 times the CO2 emissions of Nigeria. And on a per capita basis, it has about 9 times the CO2 emissions of Nigeria. So that already gives you an idea of where Nigeria actually falls. And if you take out South Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa, you discover that as a whole, our contribution is actually infinitesimal. The earlier speaker also did allude to the fact that one of the major objectives of COP22 is the so-called net zero emissions. You have major countries, especially the OECD countries, driving this idea of achieving net zero emissions by a particular set date. The problem here is trying to see if there is consonance between what these countries are driving as the goal of COP26 and of course what they are doing in terms of the actions. I mean, the UK earlier in this year approved for the construction of a coal mine in Cumbria. At the same time, we have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia coming into Europe via Germany. And the idea is to bring in natural gas. So we see developed countries driving the idea of renewable energy, solar, wind, etc. But then we also see the actions actually creating some form of dissonance between what they are driving and of course what they are doing. And it all boils down to the fact that there is so much you can do with renewable energy. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, what we will see is that countries will have to fall back on fossil fuels to meet energy security. In the UK currently, we have energy companies collapsing due to rising energy costs, as they say. The environmental impacts of renewable energy can be understood from understanding the role or the relationship between electricity, which is a productive output of energy, and of course, renewable energies as themselves. Renewable energy technologies actually allow us to harness renewable energy resources like wind, solar, and of course, generate productive energy like electricity. And so what that means is that that interface is actually not renewable in itself. So your wind turbine, your solar panels are not renewable. For me, I'm addressing the issue of the environmental impact from the aspect of electricity generation. And the reason is because electricity actually accounts for about 25% of CO2 emissions. Electricity and heat production account for about 1/4 of the CO2 emissions. Now, wind turbines, your solar panels, etc., are made from materials that are not renewable in nature. And so what that means is that to be able to achieve harnessing renewable energy resources like wind or solar to produce productive energy like electricity, we need to mine resources like copper, coal, copper, cobalt, nickel, etc., to be able to generate the materials needed to produce these technologies that can enable us convert renewable energy resources into productive use. So that's number one. So one of the impacts of, or one of the environmental impacts we definitely see from renewable energy technology, which is the primary goal of COP26 in terms of achieving the net zero emissions, is the fact that you have resource extraction. Now, another goal, of course, resource extraction comes with its own demerits that we generally see across Africa. The second environmental impact is in terms of waste. Now, definitely these particular technologies have a life cycle. So that means that when you have your wind turbine, you have your solar panels, you have your batteries, they have a particular duration for which they function. And after that period, of course, they come to the end of life. And so we have the problem of waste. Now, not just waste, but how those wastes can be managed because of the harmful effects. Now, these wastes are not biodegradable. It's important for us to know most of these wastes are not biodegradable. And so their management becomes very important. And of course, the third thing we also find is the issue of stranded assets. So it's not just a problem of what we call abandoned projects. These are not just problems peculiar to Nigeria. We also find them, of course, in South Africa. Where I was in South Africa, you have stranded assets. You also have them in Europe, America, of course, China. There could be different issues for these projects or for these stranded assets, but these are problems, of course, you find peculiar with renewable energy projects. Before going to the next slide, I want to draw our attention to quotes by the executive director of the IEA. They released a report some months ago, and what they were trying to show in the report was that there is a mismatch between the amount of resources we need to achieve our targets for net zero and the availability of those particular resources. And that's a very striking finding. I mean, when I saw it, it actually caught my attention, because as we run towards achieving the goals of net zero, which is one of the aims of COP26, one of the things we push to the back burner is the fact that the materials needed to produce the technologies to harness these renewable energy resources are finite in nature. And so what that means is that there is the possibility that there will come a time when we will run out of this material. So the question now that comes to say, what then happens when we get to that particular time? So that becomes very important. Peculiar with Nigeria, yes. So in Nigeria, for the environmental impacts, well, the recent water resource bill actually has shown us that when you have irresponsible leadership, you are definitely bound to have irresponsible policies. When we talk about resource deprivation as an impact of, as an environmental impact of renewable energy, somebody may say, hey, come on, you are going out playing to the gallery. But the answer is no. And the reason is because we've seen the current government in Nigeria, for instance, using bills to, for instance, acquire land for different purposes. And that was what the water resource bill actually showed. And so if you have irresponsible government, what is possible is that you can deprive communities of their land for productive purposes. So we need land to be able to construct these megawatts of wind farm or this solar farm, or we want to set up a biomass production. And so the government comes with such policies and then uses that to, of course, acquire land. Of course, we see that play out in the corporate world where you have big companies come into communities and, of course, acquire land. And so that's one of the environmental impacts we do face. The second one is the issue of green waste crisis. As the government continues to fail in our responsibility of meeting energy security for the country, what it does invariably is that it outsources generation to individuals. And so private households, companies take up the responsibility of actually generating electricity for themselves. And the implication is that as you have households come up with their own solar home systems or whatever, there will be a problem of the disposal of those particular wastes. And like we actually said before, Nigeria does not have a holistic framework at a local level to incentivize the disposal of this waste. So what that means is that we leave the disposal of these electrical equipment at the discretion of these individuals and companies. Now, the problem with that is these wastes are harmful to the environment. A lot of them are harmful. They are not biodegradable. You have these wastes containing things like mercury, you have them containing things like lead, you have them containing things like, poisonous substances, and these things leach into the ground. They, of course, affect humans who interact with them because they are not disposed in safe spaces. And of course, they have long-term consequences for the country. Another implication is pollution. One of the research that we conducted in South Africa, what we found was that, and it's very funny, it's a funny research, was that utilizing solar home systems on a central basis and diesel generators, very funny, to power a group of houses actually achieves greater reduction in emissions than using only renewable energy. So if you have a solar home system to power a group of houses, and in another scenario, you have solar home systems on the central basis backed up with a diesel generator, you actually achieve greater reduction in emissions in the second scenario than in the first scenario. And the reason for this is because in the first scenario, you will not be able to meet the entire energy needs of those households. And so what that means is that individual households are forced to adopt other means of meeting their energy needs that is cheap for them and they can access. And so you are not able to actually control the emission level at those decentralized points. However, in the centralized point, you're only dealing with one fossil fuel source. But then at the decentralized point where individual houses have to fend for themselves, they individually have to deal with, the different energy sources that they stack up. And of course, another impact which goes with pollution is mortality. Exposure to particulate matter is one of the leading causes of death in sub-Saharan Africa. For the next slide, I'm sorry, I'm unable to see my screen fully. Okay, so for policy perspectives for Nigeria, well, one of them is the fact that we've identified the fact that Nigeria actually has no role in COP26. I consider the relationship between Nigeria participating in COP26 as actually irrelevant and a waste of resources. And the reason is because there are better issues that Nigeria could actually engage in than participating in things where we don't have any significant role to play. Historically, we don't have the emissions, we've not contributed. And of course, in the framework, there is actually a peak, plateau, and decline model that is proposed that allows countries to be able to build their emissions up to a particular level, maintain that level for a while, and then based on different technologies or pace technologies, they're able to see their emissions decline over time. So rather than coming up with proposals to decrease emissions, when we have no idea of how much emissions we are even going to actually generate as we continue to grow as a country, develop, advance, and industrialize, our resources are better spent, doing other things. So that was why, for me, I think some of the policy perspectives we can look at is leveraging our gas reserves to achieve electrification. If we look at Germany, if Germany and Europe can be building a pipeline from Russia to Europe to supply gas, Nigeria has no reason not to do the same. And so coming up with policies that we see how we can have, rather than gas flaring, converting that gas, to powering turbines and of course generate electricity, becomes an imperative or something necessary for the country. That's number one. Number two is, as Nigeria begins to anticipate, individual preference for renewable energies, what Nigeria should do is to build comprehensive policies for waste management at the local level. So rather than waiting for when the problem becomes visible, we can, at this point, start building up a framework, not at the national level, not at the state level, but at the local level. And why do I say that? Here at home in my house, if I have waste, I dispose my waste based on classification. When they come to collect your waste, there is plastics and things, there is cartons, there are papers, there's food waste, etc. At the local level, if people can become familiar, with the different classification of waste, and then there are incentives on the part of government. What that simply means is that by the time it becomes there's a full-blown adoption of renewable energy across the country, managing the fallouts in terms of waste from that particular policy doesn't become difficult. That's number two. Another policy perspective is the fact that when you have cheap electricity from the national grid with wide penetration across the country, it becomes very easy to have adoption by households. The problem we are having is that households use whatever means of energy source they can access and it's cheap for them to meet their energy needs. But if there is competitive electricity or energy from the grid, what that simply does is that it's easy for households to buy into that particular scheme. And what that simply does is that it gives government greater control over emissions because you centralize your generation and so you're able to control your emissions. And of course, if you're able to do that, what that simply does is that you also reduce the associated mortalities that come with having people, having decentralized ways of generating their particular energy. Now, one of the things we must remember is that we need electricity first before we can begin experimenting with renewable energy. And I say this because it pains me whenever we see suggestions from Nigeria on renewable energy. You have the Renewable Energy Master Plan, you have different government agencies coming up with huge investments for renewable energy. It's painful because those policies actually are not coherent. There's a lot of disconnect between those particular policies. There's more to be benefited from having a coherent policy that drives, for instance, gas adoption in Nigeria to supply our electricity than setting up renewable energy projects in federal universities across the country. Those projects usually become stranded assets. And the reason is because of the poor maintenance culture of Nigeria. So that's very important. The first thing we need first, irrespective of the source, is electricity. Be it coal, be it whatever, is electricity. And the reason is because whether you talk of Germany, Australia, the United Kingdom, France, United States, Canada, coal, oil, fossil fuels continue to play dominant roles in providing electricity for those countries. In fact, as a matter of fact, these countries are experimenting on renewable energy on the backbone of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels continue to provide the foundation and the basis for whatever these countries are building with regards to renewable energy. So that's very important for Nigeria. Number two is the fact that there must be a decentralization of waste management policies to the local level. And the reason is I don't have to travel to London to dispose my batteries. If major companies here like PC Curries supply me my fridge or washing machine, or I replace them, they are very happy to collect the old products I have and help recycle. If I have batteries from my remote or stuff like that I want to dispose, I can easily walk to any of the major shops like Lidl or Aldi, and they have collection points for those particular. So even at the local level within communities, it's very easy for people to be able to dispose of end-of-life products. So if government can have that thinking and begin to look at ways at localizing collection of end-of-life equipment at the local level, then what that simply means is that waste doesn't play a great role in the future. That's number one. Number two is the fact that it also helps when it comes to circular economy, which is what the earlier speaker alluded to. You see, if you have a proper collection means, what that simply does is that the government is able to get this equipment without great expenses on sorting and then, recycle for whatever purposes they have. That's number two. Another policy perspective is the fact that there must be attempts by the government. You see, the idea of decentralizing or outsourcing your responsibility to private individuals limits your ability to regulate. The problem of emissions in Nigeria is that we don't even have an idea how much emissions we generate in the country. What we simply have are calculations or modeling done by the government. There's really no benchmark or basis by which the government can effectively capture how much emissions we do generate. And that's simply because the government has outsourced its responsibility to individuals and companies. Here in the UK, electricity is supplied from the national grid. Households are connected to the national grid. You have the generation companies generating electricity, supplying to the national grid, and you have distribution companies collecting electricity from the national grid and supplying to households. So there's a framework here within this country for the government to actually quantify emissions or the environmental impact of generation from the generation companies. In Nigeria, the fact that the government has no idea how much private capacity there is in generating electricity means that we are unable to quantify. And the problem is the unavailability of that data limits the government's ability to actually come up with regulations or policies to manage or cap or regulate emissions from those particular levels. And lastly is the role of community. The last speaker also made allusion to that. Communities play a very important role in the success or failure of any projects. When we were in South Africa, we were conducting research. That was one of the things we found out. Community plays a crucial role. In the current research I'm actually carrying out in the Arctic region in Europe, communities also play very active roles. If you can achieve community buy-in, what that simply means is that communities are at peace with the outcomes of any project. And so it's very important for government to ensure that as they roll out schemes at the local level, what that means is that rather than projects becoming stranded assets, because community was involved or carried along from the procedure to decision-making, execution, etc., the whole gamut, because they were carried along, what that simply does is that there is greater buy-in and success for those particular projects than when you have the top-to-bottom approach by government. I want to thank you very much for your time. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Chuka, for the incisive presentation. If you have any question for Chuka, please can you type it on the chat, and then later we'll go back to it after the last presentation. So permit me to call on the last speaker, Dr. Ayodele Ashekome, to take the floor and then give us the last presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, sir.
Can you please confirm that you can see my slides and you can hear my voice? Good. So I want to thank Pedi and Chukwuka for starting the ball rolling. Sometimes it's difficult to go last when you've had such fantastic presentations before. But in a way, it has given me time to reflect on how the legal side and how the policy side fits into this whole discussion. So I will try and dwell on some of those issues as I make my presentation. Now, I know we've already provided a foundation for this discussion by way of the introduction. But what I want to say is that the postponement of COP26 has really given us time to reflect on things, and the evidence that has emerged from the intervening period indicates clearly that there is a link between anthropogenic activities and environmental damage or climate change. That evidence is now very, very clear. And given what has happened between the outbreak of COVID-19 and where we are just now, everything points in the direction of COP26 being mostly to push this agenda for action to be taken to address climate change. And it's very interesting that Chukwuka has presented a different point of view there, where when we go to those negotiations, we shouldn't necessarily be going there to subscribe to all of the things that are on the table, given our own peculiar circumstances. And this is one of the perspectives I'm looking at this from. We know also that the recent energy crisis in the United Kingdom has clearly shown that we cannot take out fossil fuels from the energy mix. When we draw up market reforms, energy market reforms, we usually hang them on three underlying objectives. The first one is that we want to keep the lights on, and we want to do so in a way that is affordable. And lastly, we want to do so in a way that is environmentally friendly, that is sustainable. Now, these three objectives sometimes could be conflicting. You want to have cheap electricity, you might have to resort to dirty fuels or fossil fuels, at least for the time being. So it's against this backdrop that we need to look at the subject of the push for actions to be taken. We're talking about sustainability, not mortgaging the future generations' needs and requirements, our own present consumption. But while we're at it, we don't also want to suffer. We want to have cheap electricity and all of that. Now, I'm going to be using quite a few. I'm going to be showing some charts. Again, this chart simply shows that the lockdown, the reduction in travel and all of that actually meant that we could see a reduction in CO2 emissions. Right. So in a way, that was a good thing. But from the point of view of a developing country, we would see that the evidence suggests that there is the need for us to have some trade-offs or consider some trade-offs. The reason being that there is a link between your GDP per capita and your CO2 emissions. So, in other words, over the years, in order to grow, we've had to damage the environment. The extant literature, if you go back to the discussions prior to COP21, the evidence is clear that countries need to emit in order to grow. At least that is what the evidence suggests. This was particularly the case in the Industrial Revolution, which has brought us to where we are. And we've seen that evidence played out very clearly in the pursuit of development by the BRICS economy: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. You emit CO2 as part of the developmental process. Now, if we look at the written data that is talking about from the 1960s to the present time, the chart on your screen shows that we can identify three groups of companies, three groups of countries, pardon me. These countries like the United Kingdom, which we would refer to as the developed countries, like Chukwuka was saying, these countries they burned fossil fuels to get to where they are, and they are pursuing the subject of energy transition or transition to renewables from a stable base of electricity generation or power generation using fossil fuels. So for the United Kingdom, they've been there, they've won the T-shirt, they've done it, and right, they can stand from that point and talk about climate mitigation and climate adaptation. For a country like Nigeria, we have remained without the critical mass to break away from poverty, as it were. We've not leveraged on our fossil fuel resources to achieve development. You see that China and Nigeria practically started off from almost the same point. But in the past 50 years, China has massively grown its GDP per capita while emitting tons of CO2. Again, this slide demonstrates or proves the point that we were making earlier on about Nigeria not necessarily being a massive emitter or massive polluter in that sense. So the figure there bears out that story. So again, when we look at charts like this, it raises the question of fairness, the question of equitability, the justiceness of countries that have achieved development, damaging the environment, wanting to then pass on the responsibility of that to everyone, including countries that did not contribute to the damage, who unfortunately are bearing the brunt of the environmental damage. So again, leading up to COP21, this was also a very massive talking point. We cannot put the onus for adaptation and mitigation on countries that did not contribute to the damage that has occurred. And when we approach this subject, we must look at it from the economic realities of developing countries, which means that if you take all things into consideration, there is no way these countries can fund what is required to put in place mitigation measures or adaptation measures. And I think for the case of Nigeria, we look at the economic indices. The story is very, very clear. We know that oil remains the lifeblood of the Nigerian economy. And what happens in that sector will continue to exert pressures on the rest of on the other sectors of the economy. The country suffers from huge infrastructural deficit. We're talking about not having the infrastructure in place to do some of the things that energy transition would require us to do. There is high unemployment, there is high inflation. The Naira is practically worthless in terms of the exchange rate volatility. Again, for the sake of time, I will not present statistics to show all of these indices and how they tie to, or they attach to the the activities that are going on in the oil and gas industry. There is also the growing burden of debt servicing, borrowing money left, right, and center, even borrowing money to meet recurrent expenditure, which is a worrying position or worrying place to be. There's low investor confidence. There is lots of security issues. That means that investors are not willing to come to Nigeria to invest. There is poor energy access. And this list goes on and on. In fact, at the bottom end there, it says anything that can go wrong has gone wrong in Nigeria, according to Murphy's Law. And this is the context from which we should approach this discussion of the implications of COP26 for Nigeria. Just a chart to show, that Nigeria entered into recession twice within the space of 4 years. And the reason for that is not far-fetched. Like I said, the economy is tied to the fortunes of the oil and gas industry. So you see that if you look at the oil GDP growth versus non-oil GDP growth, we've experienced the most growth when oil prices have been high, and limited growth when oil prices have been down. So the chart there indicates clearly that oil drives the economy, as it were. So we must approach that subject, the subject of COP26, from this understanding of the peculiarities of the Nigerian economy. So, when we go to the discussion table, if we have the opportunity to get to that discussion table, we must be putting all of these things into perspective. And I think it is insightful when you look at the nationally determined contribution of Nigeria, the recent one that was disclosed in 2021. It shows that the bulk of our emissions comes from energy applications. There's industrial processes and product use. There is agriculture, forestry, and land use. And of course, there is the subject of waste that Chukwuka dwelt on earlier on. The plan, like was mentioned, is to reduce our emissions by, this is almost, by half in the year 2030. That is what the nationally determined contribution indicates. But again, some of these figures, it looks like somebody's just sitting somewhere and presenting information that would look good or that would sound good to those that are meant to receive the information. But do we have the means to achieve this level of reduction in CO2 emissions? So to wrap up things from my end so that we can get discussing, I didn't really want to bore you with the economic stats and all of that, but the question that arises for us is, how do we go about this conference? What should be our take on the discussions that are going on? And I've written just a few possibilities here. The first one is that we can cop out. There's nothing that says we should go along with all of these things. But of course, if you're not China, if you're not the United States of America, this might not look like an option. Given that we rely so much on the oil and gas industry, and what we make from that industry is dependent on our ability to sell as much crude as possible to the rest of the world. If the rest of the world is not taking our crude, then it becomes a problem. It compounds the problem. So if you look at the Petroleum Industry Act, it looks like the government is basically pursuing a business as usual scenario where it is saying, let's produce our oil, let's sell as much of our oil as is possible before they become stranded. And this was the point I was making when I posted on LinkedIn to promote this event. Yeah, it could be the right approach. It could be the right way to go when you do what is in your own interest in terms of maximizing your fossil fuel reserves before they become stranded. The other thing that is possible is where the funding for climate change or funding for climate change mitigation or abatement measures would need to come from the oil and gas industry. So there's a real opportunity here to revisit the Petroleum Industry Act and say, all of the money devoted to frontier exploration and all of the money about derivation and all of that can be channeled towards incentivizing clean energy or transition to renewables. I would think that instead of allocating 30% of profits to frontier production of frontier prospecting for oil, we could devote the same amount of money to encouraging investment in the renewables. And of course, one of the options that is open is that we can simply just, pass the buck to the richer countries. The richer countries themselves realize that they have been the ones responsible for the damage that has been done. And recently, Boris Johnson was saying that the richer countries should meet up with the $100 billion commitments from richer countries. Again, this could be Nigeria and developing countries saying you really need to put your money where your mouth is in terms of ensuring that actions are taken to address the climate concerns. Now, there's a bit of work I'm doing currently, looking at stakeholder negotiations, and some of the arguments or some of the positions that we can take can be depicted in the as shown in the chart, where we can have our status quo where we carry on doing whatever we're doing. But if we must move on from that position, we will need to either consider using renewables or stepping up rapidly to renewables, or carry on burning fossil fuels to come out of the COVID-19 recession. So again, a lot of tactics, a lot of approaches can be used here, where we could use negotiation. We could go to COP26 and talk to relevant countries. We could use orchestration, what is referred to as orchestration, to get to the ideal position. We could also simply just use regulation. Regulation will probably work for the existing system, carrying on burning fossil fuels and possibly putting in place abatement measures to capture some of the carbon. But again, I do not subscribe to the view that we shouldn't go to COP26, that we should stay away from COP26. We should go there and have a clear view as to what we're asking other parties to do, or what we expect the developed countries to bring to the table. Yes, I will stop there, and then we can have further conversation as we go along.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayodele. That was a beautiful presentation, especially the part that had to do with rhetorics and reality versus reality. We will now take questions. It's now time to start taking questions. We'll have to ask the guest presenters what questions we think they should help us clarify or answer. There was one which Paddy has already responded to in the chats. There was one asked by Chids Yobumbada. He said, "Thank you, Paddy, for your interesting presentation. I was interested in the caveat in Nigeria's NDC. Sorry, I don't think it's this. Okay, yeah. In Nigeria's NDC, where the country stated that it would increase its climate ambition if international supports were given to it. I wonder if such international support had been forthcoming in the past, and if yes, what has been the nature of that support? I would like to get your thoughts on this. Thank you. Paddy has answered, but I would want her to repeat what she has said there. I don't want to read it from. Paddy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, thank you for the question and for the opportunity to elaborate. I mean, just to say that, yes, Nigeria is in receipt of some support already, as are very many other developing countries. So it's not so much about whether or not we're in receipt of support, but it's also about the quantity, the amount of support that's being received and in what forms. So if we're receiving support that is only coming in the form of technical assistance, but it's not coming in the form of, say, technology transfer, then that creates problems. Or if we're receiving support that is coming in the form of loans, which again increase the debt burden. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. But I think linking up with something that Eddie mentioned, we also have to be mindful of that. And that's why I started by saying Africa is a continent. We also have to ask ourselves as a country, what are we doing? And to be honest, I can imagine a situation where some poor African country somewhere that has very little oil and gas resources turns around in a few years' time and comes to Nigeria and points to Nigeria and says, look, you're responsible for the problems we're experiencing. Because while we say that it's the developed countries that have caused all the problems and all that, let us also remember that we've been reaping from this sector. It's not like our hands have been tied behind our backs and they've come and taken the resources and degraded the environment. We've also contributed as a country through our joint ventures and all of those things. So let us be mindful of the responsibilities we also have as a country, towards our other African neighbors, brothers and sisters, and to our citizens. Thank you. I hope that addresses the question, by the way.
Okay, Paddy, yes, I think so. And there was one that he asked about, he said, the National Assembly passed the PIB, which has been assented to by Mr. President. The PIA has made significant provisions for frontier oil exploration. What implications do such action portend for climate change and commitments to international climate change obligation and COP26? You have already answered, but I want everybody to I want you to say it in front of everybody.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I think that points to what my colleagues have mentioned about this issue of policy coherence. And that's why I also mentioned in my presentation that we have to be mindful of the fact that these impacts are multi-sectoral. So we are not looking at it only as a climate problem. We also have to think about it from the perspective of those sectors that I mentioned in mitigation. So if we're increasing production of oil and gas, what does this mean for our emissions? And it's really complex because on the one hand, we want to protect the environment, but like other speakers have mentioned, we hardly can develop at the level that we want just relying on renewables. So what does this mean in terms of our energy mix? And I think really, maybe we need to look beyond just expanding production as a problem to look at what kinds of technologies are we using and how are we going to be protecting the environment and mitigating the negative impacts? Because I mean, even in Scotland, there's talks about increasing production of oil and gas, So it's not so much about increasing production, but it's also about how is this being done and to what extent can we reduce the negative impacts on the environment, but also on people, their livelihoods, the quality of life and all that. Thank you. I hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, it does. It does address the question. Eddie asked the question, which it was directed to Chuka. Chuka, are you there?
Yeah, Charles, I was just responding to two questions from Chitsi and Lenusira.
Yes.
Yeah, for the question asked by Chitsi on the idea of new policies, he's very correct. We have a problem of coming up with new policies always in Nigeria. But I think what we can do for the waste management policies is to decentralize them. So for instance, if you have a national policy on waste management. There's nothing wrong in that company partnering with, say, Coca-Cola and saying, can we have collection sites at your depot across local governments in Nigeria, where people who have these devices bring them to you, and then we have a way of aggregating them from the local government level to the state level, and then, of course, to recycling plants. So that's where you have the private partnership with the government. So the whole idea of PPP is where it comes into play in terms of decentralizing policies. So that's very true. With the question from Lenusira, she said, if you discourage ROE because they become stranded assets owing to poor maintenance culture, is it not that the challenge is with the energy source but the maintenance? Actually, no. For that question, it's not a problem of maintenance because renewable energy technologies are actually maintenance free. The problem is capacity, and that's what actually makes them stranded assets mostly in Africa. For instance, there was a popular project in Lusigweni where Shell actually facilitated solar home system for a community. The problem they had there was that you had expectations from the community and you had deliverables from Shell. Now, there was a mismatch, there was a disconnect between both of them because there were things the community expected from that particular project, but then there were things that actually happened. So the problem mostly is a problem of capacity, I would say, and not usually maintenance. On the question of renewable energy being well established in the developed countries, can Nigeria start adopting to engage a robust energy mix? Countries in the West, I would not say they have a well-developed renewable energy system because there's no country that we know of in the OECD countries that's running on 100% renewable. I mean, the UK, the US, China, or whatever countries, Germany, whatever, Japan, something, they're all running on fossil fuels. And of course, using that as a backbone for experimenting with renewables. I have a background in electrical engineering and a master's in electrical engineering. And it pains me a lot when I see advocates for 100% renewables. And the reason is because if people understand how the electrical system works, you'll be able to appreciate the complexities in how electricity supply works and how generation to transmission and distribution works. Trying to lump electricity into a black box is actually the great undoing that we have. And that's one of the mess ups we continue to see in country policies. For instance, there was a research we did where we're looking at countries like Germany, Australia, and California. You will discover that California has excessive solar home systems, solar technology in the country, but 25% of the electricity California uses is imported. So you will think that with their capacity that California actually exports electricity, but the problem is they don't have enough storage to store that electricity so that when they have demand during periods of low sunshine, they're able to use it. And so you have that duck curve in terms of their operations in California. And it's the same thing you find in countries like Australia and Germany. In fact, in Germany, electricity bill increased by over 3,000% during the introduction of the Energy Window program. So there is no country you will say that has a well-established renewable energy program because what gives them that latitude or opportunity to experiment is the fossil fuels, nuclear or whatever. Then countries are also coming up with very crafty, schemes. For instance, a country like Iceland that has geothermal technology is a privileged country. That's a natural resource that they have that enables them to have baseload technology. Or countries in the Scandinavian regions like maybe Sweden, Denmark that have very huge hydroelectric power potentials. You can't compare those kind of countries with countries like Germany. I don't know if you get the point. So the uniqueness of countries comes to play in their role. So countries that have renewables like hydropower and generate the most of electricity from those particular sources, it would be wrong for those countries to come and preach to us about moving into renewable energy because that's a natural advantage that they have. And that's why in South Africa, 90% of the electricity comes from coal because that is what they have cheaply that they can access and of course generate the electricity. The idea, then the last part of that question was Nigeria learning. Well, the beauty of what the West is doing is that we have history to learn from. If we are learning from the West, what we should learn from the West is, first of all, we should build our own electricity supply with the resources we have. So if we have natural gas, the wise thing for us to do as Nigeria is make sure that we build electricity supply that because you see, COVID has taught us something. I mean, nobody would have believed that the UK and EU could have diplomatic rows over vaccine. Nobody would believe that countries that were promoting globalization will be hoarding vaccines. You get the point. But that's the reality that we find today. America came up with a law that actually banned the exportation of vaccines from the country. And so you have these countries knowing fully well that there are less developed countries that have need of these vaccines, but they come up with very autocratic policies or policies that are actually inhumane, banning this, which already goes to show us that Nigeria should strive to ensure energy security for herself. Nigeria should make sure that countries don't have leverage over, otherwise we are back to the Gulf crisis of the 1970s. So if we have gas, there's nothing wrong in us leveraging gas, experimenting with gas, building our electricity network that utilizes gas that we can get from ourselves cheaply to generate our electricity, and then building on that, to incorporate renewables. We must also not be ignorant of the fact that if we make attempts to radically transform the system, we do not have the capacity to handle the fallout or the externalities of that. And we must see that from the way countries have recovered from the pandemic. Countries that recovered fast were countries that were able to print currencies. America, the United Kingdom, China, these are world reserve countries that have their currencies as world reserve currencies. So they could print currencies. What was Nigeria doing? Taking loans. So that already tells you that we should be able to build our own transition to net zero at our own pace. I agree with what Lemrusa said, where she said Nigeria could use the fact that we are minority contributors as an excuse to continue to be complacent. Yeah, that's true. But even if we have an irresponsible leadership, I mean, the least we can do is leverage gas or natural gas or resources we have locally for our own energy security. It's very important that we don't allow the West dictate how we develop our energy systems or configure energy systems or introduce mixes into energy systems that allow us to become dependent on them in terms of support or technical know-how. That's one of the reasons why we've also had a lot of stranded assets, across Nigeria. The Jakarta steel companies, even turnaround maintenance for our refineries are dependent on Western knowledge. So if we can't utilize our own local knowledge and local know-how, that's the whole idea of the local content policy, to develop and utilize what we have locally first to generate security for ourselves. Then we run the problem, of depending on the West every time for technical know-how, etc. I think that's the question. Those are the two questions. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question for all the speakers. Any of the speakers can answer. And my question is simply, how should what should be our response towards COP26? What should drive our response towards COP26? National interest or global interest?
I think Paddy's hand is raised or something.
Yeah, Paddy, please, can you answer me? Yeah.
So I'm one of those students in class who always raises their hands to say, yeah, I'm here. I want to. Thanks for that, Chuka. Well, I was raising my hand already, before you posed that question. So maybe what I'll do is just make the comments I was going to make, and then let me start with that point you raised. I would say national interest first. And the reason I'll say national interest is just to piggyback on what Chuka just finished mentioning. I mean, experiences with COVID and how you find that every country, it's not saying Nigeria first, but I mean, you're in the best position to understand what you need as a country. And so you're also in the best position to project those needs. And if you do not do that, I don't think anybody's better placed to do that than yourself. So I'll take national interest first, just for those reasons. And linking back to, the responses I want to make or give, this issue about renewable energy, I want to say something about that. Now, I don't think it's so much about whether we want to rely solely on renewables or not. But I think that sometimes, especially within the space as we have the privilege of being given to us this afternoon, we have an opportunity to consider policy statements, consider proposals from different perspectives. And I think it is only when we look at, suggestions, proposals from different perspectives, we look at the different parts and see how they add up to the whole, that we can actually make progress. And if I look at this renewable energy issue, now we agree that if we're talking of micro generation, right? I mean, I'm not an expert in electricity, but I'll just say this from my perspective as a sustainable development enthusiast, let's say. Now, if you look at micro generation, part of the electricity problem in Nigeria is not so much generation. So there's a generation deficit, no doubt, but there's also a problem of distribution. And I think what that tells us is that even if we use gas and we continue to generate enough to supply everybody, the distribution problem still remains. So to a large extent, we need to be mindful of how we can approach this problem of distribution. And I think that is where microgeneration comes in, decentralizing the generation of electricity. And I think that is where renewables come in. Because again, if we look at the UK, Germany, many of the countries that have built on renewable energies, it is very often from households. It is very often from this small spot. So maybe that is what we need to be thinking about as a country in Nigeria. Can renewable help us address the problem of access in households, in small businesses, in the informal sector? And I think yes. So to that extent, how can we then leverage renewables to address even the deficit in our distribution network? So that is one. Now, on this issue of stranded assets, I think that we should also consider it from a slightly broader perspective. Because very often the mainstream discourse around stranded assets when it comes to climate change is about how climate change mitigation will lead to devaluation of our resources in the oil and gas sector, or will stop us from harnessing the economic benefits, realizing the full economic value of our oil and gas resources. And if we think about it like that, then we'll find that indeed, whether it's renewables or any other climate mitigation strategy, would have implications for stranded assets. So I think we need to think about it in that long perspective. And we also have to remember, when we think about stranded assets, it is not only about the pipelines or the platforms, it is also about the not just manpower, the human resources. So take for instance, if I've built a career in oil and gas sector, and then you suddenly shut down that sector, what happens to me in terms of work? What do I do? That is also stranded assets. We need to think about it like that. If I am a food seller who has built my business around a platform somewhere or around an oil producing business somewhere, what happens to me if you take that business away from my community? So those are all assets we need to consider as a country. And I think that then brings to bear the human costs of these policies. And to that extent, it is all part of stranded assets, And thirdly, I want to talk about the water resources bill. I don't really want to talk about it, but I just want to mention that we have a responsibility to look at the text of that bill and to see to what extent it is really about the government trying to take our water resources from us. I don't agree that it is about the government taking our resources from us, but I invite all of us to not just look at the headlines, but to look at the text of the law and point to specific sections of that bill that we think are about water grabbing or whatever it is. And then let us start to have the conversation. Let us not just take this. I mean, the government is not the best, yes, but what are the options? And let us speak to hydrologists. Let us speak to people who are experts in this field of water and ask them, is it really possible for each state in Nigeria to regulate water resources? And I would say the answer is no, because I'll end by saying that let us remember that water does not fit in with political boundaries. No, water is fluid. And it then means that very easily water would flow between Rivers State and Bayelsa State. So if Rivers State is in charge of its water resources, are we going to paint Rivers State's water resources blue and then paint Bayelsa resources green so that we know where each one ends? Maybe not. So we need to think about all of these things, because in regulating water resources, we need to think about the hydrology of it as well as we're thinking about the politics of it. Thank you.
Okay, finally, we've almost come to the end of this. Finally, I have my last question, which is directed to Chukwuka. So Chukwuka Monye, in your presentation, you mentioned that what powers renewable energy in the form of wind are finite resources. So if renewable energy is powered by finite resources, and resources resources which are critical to the powering of renewable energies are finite. So what is renewable about renewable energy? That's my question.
Charles, sincerely speaking, Charles, I've been telling you this, that it's just that I haven't had time to come together. I actually want to write a paper on that. And I think it's also good for us to raise those issues now. Normally when you talk with people who are policymakers, they will tell you, you will hear them use words like unintended consequences. So there were, we had this policy, we thought about it in this framework, but then during the execution of the policy, there were some unintended consequences. And so we are learning from that. They use loose words like externalities and all that. But the problem is that we live in a world today where we have the tools and resources to actually be able to holistically, analyze policies to a very large extent, not just limited, but very large extent. Yes, we may not be able to do that 100%, but then we have tools that enable us to see the implications of various aspects of our policies on different aspects of society, be it in the social, in the economic, in the environmental, in the technical aspect, everywhere. When we have the idea of renewable energy, it's a loose term because people tell you and say, oh, you know what? Solar is renewable, wind is renewable, and they are correct because these resources are replenished constantly. But then what we are talking about is the utilization. We harness these resources to produce electricity, but then we use there's an intermediary between these resources and our productive use of those resources, because wind in itself is useless. But then we have to take wind, harness it using particular devices, and of course, generate electricity. Now, that intermediary is made from materials that are finite in nature. That's number one. Now, number two is the fact that the materials that are finite in nature is one aspect. The materials, the intermediaries themselves have a life cycle. And so even if we're able to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, where we supply electricity for the whole world using renewables, what about the next 50 years after 2050? So where does future generation get their own finite resources or those particular rare materials to produce the intermediaries to continue to enjoy the utility benefits of renewable energy? So what is renewable about renewable energy is the resource itself, the primary sources themselves. But in terms of its conversion or utilization, it's not renewable because the intermediary itself comes from finite resources. So that brings up the idea of sustainability. How sustainable is renewable energy? That becomes the question we're asking ourselves today. I mean, the whole idea of renewable, to what extent is it sustainable? Rather than having a system that wants to totally write down to zero the fossil fuel systems that we have and then push all of us into renewables, can we begin to look at the long-term implications of these resources? Don't forget that you are talking of resource control. Charles, we've been talking of oil for how many years? And countries are coming up with estimates that their oil reserves are declining. Today, you are talking of battery technology, which is the backbone for renewable energy. You are talking of Tesla and all these companies setting up shops and excavation sites in Democratic Republic of Congo and different other countries to mine these materials. China, for instance, is one of the countries blessed with the highest concentration of these resources, but they are finite in nature. That's very important. And so it means that there's a particular time when we run out of these resources, and then we have to move on to other sources of energy. So the problem is we need to start asking ourselves the questions now. And the question we're asking ourselves is, yes, we don't have any problems with renewables, but the problem is how sustainable is renewable energy? To a large extent, how sustainable, how are we going to ensure that future generations, are able to also access these particular resources, to meet their own green energy needs? That I think is the question we should start asking ourselves for the future.
Thank you very much, Chuka. I think we have come to the end of this section. The section has raised a lot of questions. It has raised a lot of questions which have been answered to the best of our ability. Chuka, you have stated that what makes renewable energy is a combination of the natural resource and the minerals that powers the natural resource, like wind. So I think, to my thinking, if that is the case, then there is absolutely nothing renewable about renewable energy. If you ask me, in the long run, yeah, if that is the case, on the pedestal of that. But we will open this debate for more contributions. In another platform, we're running a section on renewable energy and measuring the impact of net zero globally. We will call on experts to contribute as time goes on. I want to especially thank all the presenters today. Pedi Obani, that was an insightful presentation. Chukwuka Monye and Dr. Ayodele, you all gave us, acquitted yourself of the duties that we call forth for you to perform today. And then for those who sent in contribution, Dr. Eddie from the University of Aberdeen, Chizi from the University of Strathclyde, we want to thank all of you for your contribution. I sincerely want to thank the president of the Nigerian Environmental Society, Dr. Olushola Ajide, for all his tireless efforts to making sure that we had this webinar today. So until we meet in the shortest possible time to continue this debate, I would want to bring an end to this webinar today. Thank you for turning in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
No mute, Shola.
I want to acknowledge the president of the Nigerian Environmental Society in Nigeria, Dr. Dorothy Bassi, who has been with us throughout here. And I wanted to also share with us that we are to be part of what we are doing here in the UK. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen? All right. Okay, so that's the Nigerian Environmental Society UK, and we are going to be meeting tomorrow. So if you are able to join us, please join us at 6 p.m. tomorrow. If you are interested in joining us, we'll be able to send the link out to you to join us. Come alongside with us for us to be able to do more work and creating more debates, more opportunity to bring, at least encourage and bring more information regarding this issue of the environment. So we want to thank all our presenters today. It has been quite insightful about the aspect of the multiple sources of the energy which is needed for any particular nation to succeed, which Nigeria also needs, and the aspect of building character or behavior, particularly in developing world, regarding to classification of waste and dealing with that. And particularly, we want to thank Professor Kelani Bello, who asked the question on turning energy, waste energy to wealth. And I think that's a great opportunity which is still available in Nigeria, the massive waste that is generated, turning it into wealth. So thank you everyone for what you've done and for your presence. We really appreciate you and we are very, very grateful. I want to thank Dr. Ayodele. Your presentation was actually very insightful. And you know, like you say, as lecturers, when a lecturer gives a presentation and there's no question to that, it means students actually understood clearly what that presentation is. And I like that aspect of the fact of reality. And I was looking at it that the government is borrowing money. And now you can understand the economic implication of, because we cannot print money like other nations like America, the UK, and China. Now we are resorting to borrowing money to be able to find a way out of the quagmire which we are. But the other aspect of it is there also that we can also begin to, as researchers and academics, look at other sources of how sustainable we can help our nation to continue to advance. So thank you very much, everybody. We look forward for you to join us in the Nigerian Environmental Society, the UK chapter, and that we can do, continue to do work together. So thank you very much, everybody. When we see you again, when we invite you for our next webinar, please do spend time to be with us. Thank you, everybody. And so on that note, we'll just draw a close to, and I thank all the members of the executive and all that are here. The secretary, I thank you very much, and everybody. All right, that's me done. So thank you. So see you in our meeting. So join us. Just reach out to me or the secretary or any of the speakers, and they will help you in trying to get across to us. Thank you very much, and do enjoy the rest of your day. It's sunny here in Aberdeen, and we're going to enjoy the sun. So bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.